Hello, thank you for the introduction. So this paper provides perhaps a bit of a different focus than the others in the conference, whereas a lot of them so far have focused on the Eastern European and Soviet context under lived communism. This shifts to fiction in a Western liberal capitalist society. So the title is Quiet Containment, Cold War Cultural Governance, and the Reconfiguration of Labor in National Film Board of Canada Cinema. So Cold War era McCarthyist purges are often associated primarily with the United States. However, some scholars argue that the Canadian version was even more pervasive. It began earlier, lasted longer, and produced a deeper shift in the balance of socio-political forces. The National Film Board of Canada was founded in 1939 as a state agency dedicated to documentary filmmaking, and initially, later it was fiction, but documentary filmmaking at the outset, and public education. It played a central role in shaping post-war cultural narratives of the nation, its history, and its social conflicts. This paper looks at how fiction films operated within the boundaries of acceptable critique. The argument is that rather than overt censorship, films reflected cultural governance through containment. The National Film Board of Canada was established, as I said, in 1939 under the National Film Act. The intent was to produce films that would, quote, interpret Canada to Canadians, using documentary and narrative cinema as tools for public education and national communication. Throughout the World War II period, in line with anti-fascism and the working class politics of the 1930s, filmmakers increasingly viewed cultural production as part of a wider project of social education and democratic reform. However, post-1945, the political climate in which NFB operated changed dramatically. As Cold War tensions intensified, Canadian political discourse increasingly emphasized national unity, political moderation, and suspicion towards radical movements. NFB's tone therefore shifted from a position of protest, or mild protest, towards a more comfortable liberalism. So what I'm doing is building on previous scholarship, notably Khoury 2007, who looked at that wartime working class film project and context. And I'm interested more in how the post-war transition was reflected in fiction films, specifically how social conflict was represented. So this includes labor as well as economic crises, colonial displacement, and also gender relations. So my methodological approach was designed to provide both a broad overview of NFB's fictional output and a focused analysis of representative films across several decades. The starting point was the National Film Board's online catalog of film productions. The analysis focused specifically on fiction films produced between the 1950s and 1980s. So there's hundreds of films, so I can't look at them all. So the purpose was not to cover everything, but to identify recurring narrative patterns through a structured sample of films. So I used a stratified sampling strategy. Films were first grouped by decade, according to production date. From each decade, a small set of films was initially identified from the listings, and then one film was selected for more detailed analysis. So one film from each decade for analysis. The films chosen for closer examination were Strike in Town, Drylanders, Cold Journey, and The Masculine Mystique. So now we'll go through and look at each of these films. So Strike in Town in the 1950s dramatizes a labor dispute in a small Canadian furniture manufacturing community. The narrative centers on tensions between workers and management as employees prepare to strike over issues related to wages and seniority. Although the dispute concerns wages and job security, the workers are portrayed as relatively stable members of the local middle class with homes, families, and a degree of economic security. When negotiations initially fail, a government conciliation board is introduced. The board is described as representing the interests of all citizens, positioning the state as neutral mediator. The narrative centers around the local community. In this way, Strike in Town frames labor conflict primarily as a community problem requiring mediation, rather than as a manifestation of structural antagonism between labor and capital. Government institutions and elected officials are presented as neutral arbiters, acting on behalf of the public interest. The film therefore illustrates how labor conflict could be represented without invoking systemic critique of capitalism. This reflects a broader Cold War tendency to translate political conflict into socially manageable narratives of negotiation and consensus. So moving now to the 1960s, I looked at Drylanders, a 1963 film. This was National Film Board's first English language feature film. Through a family saga, the film dramatizes the settlement of the Canadian West and the drought that accompanied the Great Depression in the 1930s. The protagonist Daniel Greer and his family leave city life in eastern Canada with the promise of free land on the prairies. With the help of neighbors and through perseverance against the harsh natural environment, the family gradually establishes a successful farm. However, the drought beginning in 1929 and subsequent economic crisis bring severe hardship. The central conflict in Drylanders is framed from the outset as a struggle between settlers and the harsh prairie environment. While the Depression is present as a historical backdrop, the causes of hardship are primarily represented through environmental conditions and the challenges of rural life. Crop failure, food scarcity, and the eventual decline of the farm are all linked to environmental conditions rather than to broader economic structures such as markets, credit systems, and state policy. In this way, Drylanders reframes economic crises as environmental hardship and personal endurance rather than as a consequence of broader structural conditions. Although the Great Depression on the Canadian prairies was shaped by drought, there was also market collapse, debt, and significant political mobilization among farmers and labor groups. Such dynamics are largely absent from the film. Instead, hardship is individualized and naturalized. Resolution is tied to the return of rain rather than to social or political change. And the film in the 1970s I looked at was Cold Journey. This film follows a 15-year-old boy named Buckley. He's a First Nations or Indigenous boy attending a residential school who longs to return to his home and way of life. When he does return to the reserve, however, he finds himself unable to fully reintegrate, having lost both linguistic and cultural connection to his community. After Buckley is found dead in the snow, the narrative reconstructs the events leading up to his death, emphasizing his inability to find a place between Indigenous and settler worlds. The central conflict in Cold Journey concerns dislocation of Indigenous identity. Within the context of the residential school system, while Cold Journey engages themes of residential schooling, racism, and economic marginalization, these elements are primarily framed through the personal experience of the protagonist, rather than as expressions of broader structural conditions. From the outset, Buckley is depicted as isolated and socially detached, a characterization that individualizes his struggle and limits its connection to collective or systemic contexts. Although the film gestures towards colonial institutions and economic pressures, these forces are not developed into an explicit critique. Instead, the narrative resolves through fatalism, translating systemic conditions into a story of personal displacement and inevitable loss. In historical context, in the 1970s in Canada, Indigenous political movements were increasingly articulating critiques of land dispossession, state policy, and economic marginalization, sometimes intersecting with broader analysis of capitalism and definitely intersecting with colonialism. In contrast, this film largely reframes these dynamics at the level of identity and individual experience. Structural conflict remains present but underdeveloped. ultimately resolved through fatalistic narrative that emphasizes displacement and loss rather than political or systemic transformation. And finally, moving to the 1980s, I looked at a film called Masculine Mystique. This is a docudrama which explores shifting gender roles and intimate relationships through the experiences of four men at different stages of adult life. The film follows Blue, a man in his 30s searching unsuccessfully for a stable relationship, Alex, a married father engaged in an extramarital affair, and Mort and Ashley, both divorced and navigating the challenges of forming new attachments. Structured around conversations and interactions with women, the narrative focuses on emotional uncertainty, commitment, and changing expectations within heterosexual relationships. The film situates these personal struggles within a contemporary urban social setting, emphasizing questions of identity, intimacy, and self-understanding. The central conflict in the Masculine Mystique concerns shifting expectations surrounding gender roles and intimate relationships in a contemporary urban context. Rather than presenting conflict at the level of broader social and economic structures, the film focuses on tensions experienced within personal relationships. This framing aligns with what the film critic Thomas Waugh describes as the post-war, quote, gender settlement, in which a stable middle-class model of masculinity became culturally dominant. The film translates broader social change into a problem of identity and communication. Structural shifts in labor markets, family organization, and social reproduction remain largely absent. So looking at the pattern across the 4 decades here, rather than foregrounding class antagonism and structural critique, these films translate conflicts into forms compatible with liberal governance, including mediation, resilience, fatalism, identity, and the private sphere. Throughout, structural tensions persist, but the explanatory frame shifts from overt, albeit contained, labor conflict in the 1950s to psychologized private sphere in the 1980s. In this sense, the transformation observed in NFB fiction films reflects not the disappearance of political conflict, but its rearticulation within a hegemonic discourse aligned with Cold War liberalism. Noteworthy across all films is what is absent. Among the films examined, Strike in Town offers the most explicit depiction of labor or class conflict. This representation sits alongside a broader Cold War context of extensive surveillance of unions, the purging of suspected radicals, and the marginalization of more militant forms of labor organizing. In this context, the film's emphasis on procedural negotiation reflects a narrow field of acceptable political expression. Conflict is acknowledged, but contained within institutionally sanctioned forms. We could make similar observations about the other films, notably what was absent. For example, Drylanders omits structural causes of the Great Depression and prairie populism and labor organizing that took place in the 1930s. Cold Journey omits references to indigenous political movements in the 1970s, and Masculine Mystique omits the profound labor reconfiguration, deindustrialization, and the decline of male breadwinners in the 1980s. The question is not whether films should be ideological, but which forms of explanation are made available and which are closed off. A useful contrast could be drawn with Soviet and Eastern European cinema, particularly socialist realism. These films often foregrounded labor, production, and class relations, situating individual experience within explicitly articulated social and economic structures. The difference is not one of ideological correctness, but of representational logic. Whereas socialist cinema frequently rendered social conflict in systemic terms, NFB productions often translated such conflict into forms compatible with the liberal consensus and cultural governance. The issue then is not the absence of overtly political or communist narratives, but a narrowing of interpretive frameworks through which social conflict is made intelligible. Repression in the Cold War period was often subtle and indirect. operating through institutional restructuring rather than overt censorship. This included purges that narrowed the range of acceptable political expression, contributing to a cultural environment in which social conflict could be represented only within constrained narrative frameworks. The weakening of the NFB also occurred within a broader context of American cultural dominance, further shaping the limits of Canadian cultural production. So the main argument here is not that these films were somehow deficient because they did not contain overt class analysis, but that they display a representational pattern that is meaningful in institutional and historical context. Across these films, social conflict is not erased but translated from structural antagonism into individualized environmental and interpersonal narratives. This is consistent with what other scholars have remarked. The Canadian film has often avoided overt ideological confrontation, instead privileging ambiguity, restraint, and negotiated resolution. So thank you for your attention, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow up.